What's up, heathens? How ya doing? Today we're talking with Richard Carrier about his new app that he's been working on called Crestus. And we're going to be talking about that, but we're also going to be talking about just several different issues in general. So if you're interested in this discussion, then please stay tuned. All right, so hi Richard, how are you doing today?
Hey, doing great, thanks.
Yeah, awesome. So now I'm kind of curious. Can you tell us like a little bit about the app? Like, what is it? What is it for? What does it do?
Yeah, it's called Crestus. It's an acronym we made up, but it's in conjunction with Reality Revolutions. They had this idea that they wanted this app that if someone wants to debate or explore the historicity debate, the debate over whether Jesus existed or not, the app would have every argument, pro and con, in there, and all the information, so you could just quickly find it and then find like a little summary and stuff. And then ultimately, like with even references and links and things, we're building it out over time. So right now, it's just the skeleton of the stuff is up in there. So you can get the app and play around with it. There's a lot of info in there and useful stuff. We'll talk about that. Yeah. But as the months go on, as the years go on, we're going to keep improving it. So it's going to be more and better. And I'll talk about some of the improvements that will come out in July, hopefully by the end of July, that we're talking about as well. So that's the basic concept of the app. And then the rest is just what does it do, I guess, what's in it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I know at the very start of the screen the screen there, it talks about like what is the mythicist argument, and I'm just kind of wondering, like, could you briefly go over, like, because a lot of people have different ideas about what mythicists say.
Yeah, right. That's interesting. So when you first open the app, of course the main screen comes up. It's just the window of it, and then if you tap that, then you get your first menu, and the first menu has a variety of things on it. One tells you all about the Crestus app, how it was developed, what Crestus means, and all of that. Another is the Bayesian Calculator, which we're going to talk about, which actually can be used for other things. That's one of the most useful tools in this app already. Is that you actually have a Bayesian calculator that you can plug evidence into, put your own estimates in, and get a conclusion. It does all the math for you, and it's in here for you to do that for the Jesus debate. But it's not specific to that, so that you could use that app for anything, any argument or debate. So that's a really handy tool. We'll talk about that. I've got a chronology in there, a glossary that we're building out more and more. Just if you're looking for a weird term, want to know what something means or who some name references, you quickly find that in the glossary. And then the people, which so if you click on people in the menu, you'll see a list of different categories of folks. And so the new menu there is experts who doubt Jesus existed. So if you want to go in there and see who actually has qualifications in the field, but is a doubter, and it's that you often hear the claim that like there's no qualified expert doubts the existence of Jesus. In fact, there's lots, and so they're all listed in there. And then I have like good mythologists and bad mythologists, and we invented this word. A mythologist is like an apologist for Mythicism. And the good ones are the ones who actually make good arguments or convey good arguments, and the bad ones are ones that have really terrible arguments for mythicism, and those are the ones we want to like warn people against. And like one of the classic examples, if you click bad mythicism, you go in there, you'll see a list of three right there now: Joseph Atwill, Akaria S., and Timothy Freak and Peter Gandy. And so the Freak and Gandy and Akaria and Joseph Atwill, these are the most common ones that people cite. There are a few others. And we explain in there why you shouldn't rely on their work or their theories, and their theories are like crank, essentially. No, the serious stuff, there is actually valid peer-reviewed Jesus mythicism now. So it actually is not the crank stuff, and you have to really separate those two things, and that's hard for people sometimes when you've only been exposed to it online on the internet. But then I have, of course, the list experts who believe Jesus existed, like who are the best defenders of historicity. Bart Ehrman is in there, Mark Goodacre, and others. And then Christian apologists defending historical Jesus. We put them apart because Christian apologists rely on arguments that are just out of actually the mainstream. Like they want to claim that they're the mainstream, but really they're biblical inerrantists and literalists. And they have their own little apologetical arguments that are often bullshit or lies sometimes. So but we've got them in there, so you can really tell the difference between like real experts that you can trust who are advocating for the historicity of Jesus and these kind of hucksters that are advocating for the historicity of Jesus for the defense of the faith, right? There are different folks. And then I have like a list of amateurs who defend the historical Jesus to be aware of as well. So you have this section of people that you can go into and like look at who are the 8 people in this debate, who's arguing what, who can you trust, who not. Who should you look at, and things like that. So they've got that. And then, of course, the main thing right at the top of the main menu is why Jesus was mythical. And this, you're asking, your first question is like, what do you mean by that? Like, how could Christianity have begun if there wasn't a Jesus, right? What is our theory of origins, basically? And then we click in that, and you get the first menu is Christianity without a Jesus. What does that even mean? And you click in there and it's got the minimal Jesus myth theory, which is just the basics of what the peer-reviewed theory is, like the one that's passed peer review. Right. And it's the only one that's passed peer review so far. So there's really only one alternative explanation. Either Jesus existed in some form, and there's a whole bunch of theories of Jesus' existence, or the religion started this other way, which is it started with visions of a celestial event involving a celestial being named Jesus, who a lifetime later got put into stories set on Earth in the same way that a lot of other gods were. And so like his story, and that was to allegorize the gospel. And eventually people started selling that as the truth. Like there was a sect, and that sect that was selling that as the truth is the sect that prevailed and decided which documents get saved and which ones get destroyed or left to rot, basically. And so that's the basic theory. And it's all spelled out in there so you can see it and worked out and explained. And so people aren't left in the dust as terms of like, what do you even mean by that? And then you can get to, I've put some other things in there. If you go into Christianity without a Jesus again, and you'll see 2 things: the minimal Jesus myth theory, which I just described, you could click through to that, and then the 48 elements. So those who know my book on the historicity of Jesus, or even if you don't, in the book in chapters 4 and 5, I number 48 basic facts that are really not disputable, but a lot of people don't know that they're true, and they change the way that you understand the context of these things. So it actually changes your estimates of probabilities once you know these things are true. And so I go through them, number them 48, and show the evidence and stuff in the book. But here I just have the list of 48 with a really quick summary for each one of what it is. Right. And so for people who want to like quickly look through that list or reference it or something like that, that's there for them, that use as well. But then after that, you've got underneath Christianity without a Jesus, you've got all the lists of possible evidence and arguments. And so that section needs a lot of work in terms of fixing the menu structure, building out the menu structure further. So these are things that are coming. We're going to do a lot of this in July. And then and we'll keep improving it. So as more stuff comes up, we'll add it to the app. So the app will continually be updated with this stuff. So eventually it'll have everything in it, and we'll keep it with everything in it. And that's the basic structure. And then from there, you can bounce around inside the app and look for specific arguments or specific things, pieces of evidence and stuff, and what does it say. And the idea is to really help you find the thing and then give you a quick bullet point list of what's the problem with this evidence or what isn't the problem with this evidence.
That's all really great. And like I said, I've went through the app, and it's so interesting to go through and like see the list of things, because you guys also have like a list of like the extra biblical sources too. Mm-hmm. And I mean, you go through like what they are and what they say, like a really brief explanation. Yeah. And so it's a very useful app. And with the updates that you say that are coming mm-hmm. out, I think that it could be a really great tool for anybody that is curious or wanting to defend mythicism. Yeah.
It's helpful for keeping things straight, right? You're like, wait, what is the evidence of Tacitus again? Or like, wait, what did Josephus say? Like, if you want to really like go in there and then even see like what are the responses to these kinds of items of evidence that get listed. But mm-hmm. yeah, totally. That's the goal of the app, is to make it a useful tool for folks.
Yeah, definitely. Now, one thing you were talking about is Bayesian analysis and how it's got a Bayesian calculator. Mm-hmm. And I'm kind of curious if you could sort of take us through, like, what is Bayesian analysis and how absolutely. Are you employing it?
Yeah, for those who are watching the camera, if you're wondering why I'm looking down during this whole thing, it's here, I'll just show you really quickly. I'm looking at my version of the app on this iPad. And flipping through it, and then we'll bring it up. You'll be able to see it on the screen as well. We'll have that put in for you, so you can see what I'm seeing and how the app works. So if you go back to the main menu and you've got Bayesian calculators on there, you can just click through that. And there's a bunch of explanation entries, the menu of like what is Bayes Theorem, how to use Bayes Theorem, all of that stuff is in there. And then at the bottom is start, and you can just hit start and go right into it. But you might want to go read some of the explanations before you jump in there if you've never done Bayesian reasoning before. But the basic structure that we've put in here is the odds form. And so that just means it's really simple. The posterior odds, or the final odds that something is true. Like, what are the odds that this is true? Equal the prior odds times the likelihood ratio. So it's just basically two numbers that you put in there. And it's really like four numbers, because like an odds are a ratio, right? So, but you have the prior odds, and then you have the posterior, or the likelihood, the odds of the evidence. And so you really have to enter just those two things. But the evidence can be a bunch of stuff, right? You could put one number in for all the evidence, but you could also break the evidence down and say, what is the impact of each piece of evidence, taking into account like their dependency and things like that. And the app lets you do that. So you can go, once you get into the evidence part, you can keep hitting plus and adding items of evidence, and it will automatically sum or do the calculation for what is the total odds of the evidence, what is the total likelihood ratio after you've entered each item of evidence and rated it yourself, like estimated what you think is the case. And you can keep building those out. You can name them anything you want, which is why you could use the app or the Bayesian calculator for other things. It doesn't even have to be the historicity of Jesus. But yeah, the first thing that pops up when you go in there is the prior odds on Jesus existing. And for each one of these, it asks for your worst, like what do you think are the worst possible? What is the lowest odds that Jesus could have existed? Just what do you think your prior odds are before you've even looked at the evidence? Like, what do you think is the worst one? And then the best. What do you think are the best odds? And you create margins of error, like your lowest estimate and your highest estimate. And you think like, what is as far up as I can reasonably believe it? What is as far low as I can reasonably believe it? So you sort of get this honest range of numbers. It's somewhere in here, we don't know, but that represents our uncertainty. So that's how you can like include your uncertainty in this. And so each time it'll ask for the worst and the best. What are the worst odds? What are the best odds? And you got to think honestly, like what do I think is the lowest prior probability that I would accept for Jesus? And then you put that in, and it's just odds, 2-to-1 odds, 3-to-1 odds, 2-to-3 odds, whatever you think it is. And something like 2-to-1 odds means it's twice as likely that he existed than that he didn't, right? So, and that would be like a 1 in 3 chance, is the way that works out mathematically. But if you just think of it, how many more times, like how much more likely is it, one way or the other? And then the second stage is odds of the evidence existing if Jesus existed relative to if he didn't. So it's like how much more likely. So you can take a piece of evidence. What I'm going to do here, and what it shows you is the total worst and total best, but it's going to calculate those. You don't type those in. What you do is you go down and you see this thing that says evidence with the number 1 by it. And you would click up in the top right with the little editing symbol, and it'll let you name that evidence. I'm going to name it Tacitus, this first item of evidence. And you can name it whatever you want. And I'm going to call it that. And then we'll say this represents the reference in Tacitus, the Annals of Tacitus. He has this one reference where he says, well, the Christians claim this about Jesus. And that's like really the first example of a non-Christian historian referencing the historical Jesus that we have. Now, there's questions about this evidence. Did Tacitus actually write that? Like, is that a Christian interpolation in later centuries? Or if he wrote it, where did he get that information? And these are important things you have to think about when you're doing the odds. And I'm just going to leave the worst and best odds at 1-to-1, meaning it's equally likely that Tacitus would say that if Jesus existed or if he didn't. And the reason is even in the best case scenario, right, the best case scenario where Tacitus actually wrote what we have. Now, of course, he didn't write what he have, then the odds that he wouldn't mention Jesus are the same either way, because either Jesus was a total nobody that he didn't know about, and so his not mentioning Jesus is not an argument against the historical Jesus. It's just as likely that he wouldn't mention it that way. Or if Jesus didn't exist, then obviously he's not going to mention Jesus either. So it's equally likely, even in the worst case scenario where he didn't even mention Jesus. But even in the best case scenario where you say he totally did, he said exactly that, he doesn't say like he checked government archives or anything like that. He's just reporting what Christians were telling him. And this is in the early 2nd century after the Gospels were written and spread. So he's basically just repeating what the Gospels say through Christian informants. And so that's just as likely whether Jesus existed or not, because the Gospels, if Jesus didn't exist, the Gospels are fictions about him that Christians in the 2nd century believed were true or were selling as true, even to outsiders, even if they themselves secretly were talking about it not being that way. So it's equally likely whether Tacitus would mention that, whether Jesus existed or not, because it's the same probability.
Right. Well, I'm wondering, because I was listening to a few things this morning, and somebody, I don't know if you know Tim O'Neill.
Yes, I know Tim O'Neill.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he says that it was not part of the Christian theology or whatnot that Jesus was crucified by Pilate, and he cites
during when Tacitus wrote.
Right. That's what he's saying, and so.
Are you sure that's what he said? Because that's basically saying none of the Gospels were written in the 1st century.
Well, I know, but I listened to it this morning, and I was really dumbfounded when he said, "Oh, that was not like something that was widely circulated in the Christian community at that time." And
I don't know how he knows that or how that makes any sense. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't know that either, but that's one counter thing. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, how would you suggest that factor in?
So, like, I'm trying to reconstruct that argument. I'm assuming he's saying that his idea is that it's unlikely that Tacitus would mention that Jesus was crucified by Pilate unless he actually was. That's what he's trying to argue.
Right.
And now if you believe that, now I think that he's estimating wrong. But if that's what you want to put in there, you can put this in here. So in fact, actually, let me go back and go to I'm leaving it at 50-50. So the prior odds I'm going to leave at 50-50, and we'll see how they change. So we'll do his argument. We'll say worst case, we'll say he's honest enough to admit that worst case scenario, he's wrong about that, and therefore it's 50-50 again. But then let's give him his argument. Let's concede it for the sake of argument here, and say his best odds. What are the best odds that this evidence would exist? And he's trying to say, like, well, let's say, for example, it's twice as likely that Tacitus would mention this if Jesus existed than if he didn't, right? Like, how much more likely is this? Or you can think of it the other way around. It's like, it's unlikely that he would mention this unless it was true. How many more times unlikely is it than the alternative, right? So you can say, let's say 3-1. I'm going to put it on top. I'm going to say 3-1 odds. So 3 above, and leave 1 below, and that's in the best odds for the evidence of Tacitus, meaning the evidence of Tacitus is 3 times more likely to exist if Jesus existed than if he didn't. So we're arguing, that's what Tim O'Neill is trying to argue. His argument is completely bogus, but what would happen there is pointing out the bogusness of the argument would change your estimates of the probabilities. Mm-hmm. So that's why understanding background knowledge is key. In Bayesian reasoning, your estimates are always conditional on background knowledge. And so what Tim O'Neill has done is he's invented fake background knowledge. And is using that to create the estimates of probability in his head. Even if he's not putting a number to it, he's essentially saying that this evidence is less likely unless Jesus existed. And so that you could put a number to that. Well, how less likely? Like how strong is this evidence? And that's what you mean when you say evidence is really strong for something. You're saying it's much more likely on that theory than the best alternative. So even when you talk about strength of evidence, weak evidence, strong evidence, very strong evidence, you're still talking about numbers. You're just not thinking about what those numbers are.
Right.
And so what Bayes' theorem does is it forces you to actually ask yourself, well, what do I mean by that? When I say it's strong evidence versus weak evidence, well, what is the difference? What do you mean by that? And so that's why you're putting numbers in, because you're really forcing yourself to think about this. And you might think, well, but I might be wrong about the numbers. And you can say, well, that's why you have a worst and a best. That's why you come up with what are the extremes. And that way you have your margins of error and your uncertainty is built right into the equation. And so you're actually including mathematically a model of your uncertainty. So I'm going to give it to him on this. But notice that when we correct the background knowledge, when we put the correct knowledge in and take out the bogus stuff he just made up, your estimates are going to be different. And I think it collapses back to 1-on-1, 1-to-1. It's the same odds that Tacitus would mention this regardless of whether Jesus existed or not, because he's really just repeating the Gospels, and the Gospels already exist on both theories. So,
well, yeah, I think that what Tim was considering, like when Tacitus was talking about, like 64 AD,
yeah,
and he's saying, and you know, he's not thinking.
Oh,
about
I see what you're saying. Yeah, he's mistakenly assuming that Tacitus is saying Christians in 64 were saying this. But Tacitus doesn't say that. Tacitus just says, oh, these Christians are these people who say this thing. Tacitus's information is coming from the 2nd century. So he's reporting what Christians then are saying.
Right.
And just attributing it to the Christians in 64, right? We don't have any evidence that he had a source that said this about the fire of 64. In fact, we have evidence that he didn't, but that's a whole other thing when we get into Pliny the Elder and what his likely source was for the fire stuff. But his likely source for the Christians was Pliny the Younger,
right.
his contemporary in the early 2nd century.
Because he regularly wrote to him.
Yeah. So this what O'Neill then is doing. He's putting again fake background knowledge into the thing. He's pretending we know that Tacitus, or even that Tacitus said, even though that would be a lie, that Tacitus was getting that information about Jesus being crucified by Pilate from a source written in 64 or around 64, rather than from a contemporary source telling him what these Christians believed. Right. And so, but there's no evidence that that's the case. So once you pull that fake background knowledge out, your odds collapse again. You have to re-estimate the numbers. And so that's what he's doing, is he's putting fake background knowledge in to try and jigger the numbers, essentially.
Right.
So that's how you've got to be aware of that. You got to not do that. Mythicists need to not do that too, because there are mythicists who do this as well, who put fake knowledge in and try to get the numbers out that they want. But that's an invalid use of the method.